I remember standing in the hospital corridor, clutching my cotton robe with trembling fingers as I made my way back to my room. The anesthesia was still wearing off, my mouth dry, and a dull ache pulsed beneath the bandages across my chest. Through the fog of medication, I heard laughter, familiar voices floating from my private room. When I reached the doorway, I froze. My 3 adult children stood around my hospital bed, hands filled with photos of my jewelry, furniture, and artwork. A yellow legal pad on the tray table had 3 columns: Melissa, Daniel, and Rebecca. My possessions, some I'd owned for decades, were being sorted into neat lists while I was still wearing my surgery bracelet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The surgery to remove the tumor had been successful. The doctor was optimistic. But something else had died in that sterile hospital room: my illusions about my children. I stood unnoticed in the doorway, watching them negotiate over items I hadn't even considered parting with. My vintage pearl necklace, a gift from their father on our 20th anniversary. The antique writing desk that had belonged to my grandmother. The watercolor painting from our trip to Lake Tahoe. Melissa, my eldest, held my phone, scrolling through photos of my home. "Mom won't need the good china anymore," she said. "She'll probably downsize after this scare." When I cleared my throat, they jumped like startled deer. "Mom!" Rebecca gasped, quickly sliding the legal pad under a magazine. "You're back early." Daniel awkwardly tucked my phone behind a flower arrangement. "We were just organizing some things." I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply walked to my bed with as much dignity as my surgical gown would allow and said, "I think you should all go home now. I'm very tired." They left with mumbled excuses and promises to call tomorrow. None of them took the yellow pad. It remained hidden under the magazine, this record of their betrayal. That moment, right there in room 317 of Mercy General Hospital, is where my story begins. Not when I gave birth to each of them in this same hospital. Not when I worked 2 jobs to put them through college after their father died. Not when I helped with down payments on their first homes. No. My story begins in the aftermath of surgery, when the woman who had given everything was treated like she was already gone. Her possessions divided up like spoils by the very people she had sacrificed for. And they had no idea I had seen their list. No idea I had memorized every item they had claimed. No idea what I was about to do. Before we continue, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories about family, betrayal, and reclaiming your power. You don't raise children thinking one day they'll start dividing your possessions while you're still using them. You raise them because you love them, because from the moment they first grab your finger with their tiny hands, you believe you're creating a family that will stand by you through anything. That's how it was with my 3 children. Just me and them since their father, Richard, passed, away from a heart attack 15 years ago. Melissa had just finished college. Daniel was a sophomore, and Rebecca, my baby, was still in high school. I was 47 when Richard died, leaving me with 3 children to support and a mortgage that suddenly felt insurmountable. I didn't even ask the kids to get part-time jobs. I simply picked up extra shifts at the hospital where I worked as a physical therapist, and on weekends, I took a second job managing the front desk at a local hotel. I'd come home with aching feet and hands smelling of disinfectant, but I always made sure there was a home-cooked meal waiting when they returned from school or work. We had our routines. Sunday mornings were for big breakfasts, waffles with strawberries, scrambled eggs, bacon. I'd wake up early to prepare everything, even after working a late shift. During holidays, I maintained all the traditions Richard and I had established. Christmas stockings filled with the same mixture of practical items and silly toys, even as they grew into adults. Easter egg hunts in the backyard that eventually became Easter brunches. I kept their childhood home intact so they would always have somewhere that felt permanent in an impermanent world. They were good kids, or so I thought. Ambitious, intelligent, successful in their chosen fields. Melissa became a corporate attorney, married to Stephen, with 2 children of her own. Daniel went into finance, always chasing the next big investment opportunity. Rebecca, the artist of the family, worked as a graphic designer, recently engaged to a doctor she'd met at a gallery opening. I was proud of all of them, not just for their accomplishments, but for who I thought they were as people. When they got older and moved out, I continued to be their safety net. When Melissa needed help with childcare, I rearranged my schedule to watch my grandchildren. When Daniel's first business venture failed, I gave him $30,000 from my retirement savings to help him start over. When Rebecca wanted to take an unpaid internship at a prestigious design firm, I covered her rent for 6 months. I did it all, without hesitation, without keeping score, because that's what family meant to me. Richard had been prudent with our finances. His life insurance policy, combined with decades of careful saving and some wise investments, had left me comfortable, though not wealthy. Each of the children had a trust fund set up when they were born, modest by some standards, but substantial enough to give them a good start. Richard had structured them to become available in increments, a portion at 25, another at 30, and the full remainder at 35. Melissa had already received her full amount. Daniel had accessed 2/3 of his, with the final portion coming in a few years. Rebecca, at 29, had received just over half. I never thought much about those trust funds after Richard died. They were managed by our family attorney, Jim Patterson, who sent yearly statements and handled all the disbursements. The kids knew about them, of course, but we rarely discussed the details. Money wasn't something I wanted at the center of our relationship. I focused on building memories, on being present, on supporting their dreams. I thought they had learned those values from me. The first sign that something wasn't right came quietly, without drama. Just a small doubt I almost dismissed. It was during the weeks leading up to my surgery. The diagnosis had come suddenly, a tumor that required immediate attention. Not definitively malignant, but concerning enough that my doctor scheduled surgery within 2 weeks of discovery. I called each of the children personally to let them know, keeping my voice steady, reassuring them that the prognosis was good. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It's just a precaution, I told them. They're catching it early. I didn't want them to worry, but I did want them to know. What surprised me was their response. Not the concern or offers of support I expected, but questions that seemed oddly focused elsewhere. Melissa was the first. After a perfunctory, "Oh, Mom, that's terrible," she asked, "Have you updated your will recently?" When I hesitated, surprised by the question, she quickly added, "Just in case. You know how these things go. Better to be prepared." A few days later, Daniel called with questions about my insurance policy and whether I had considered getting my affairs in order. Rebecca, during a brief visit to drop off some organic soup she'd bought, not made, glanced around my living room and casually asked if I'd ever thought about simplifying my life. "You have so many things, Mom. It must be exhausting to maintain all this." I brushed these comments aside, attributing them to normal anxiety about a parent's health scare. People process worry in different ways, I told myself. Perhaps focusing on practical matters was their coping mechanism. Still, something felt off, like a familiar song played slightly out of tune. I just couldn't place what was wrong until that moment in the hospital room when I saw the yellow legal pad with its 3 neatly labeled columns. The day after surgery, I asked the nurse to help me sit up in bed. My chest ached from the procedure, but my mind was startlingly clear. The yellow legal pad remained where they had hidden it, under a magazine on the tray table. When the nurse left, I pulled it out and studied it carefully. The lists were detailed, specific. Melissa had claimed my jewelry, including pieces I'd inherited from my mother. Daniel wanted the artwork and my car, a 2-year-old Audi I had purchased after decades of driving practical family vehicles. Rebecca had marked the furniture, particularly antiques and items with unique aesthetic value. At the bottom of the MUI pad was a note about financial assets with a question mark. They hadn't quite figured out how to divide those yet. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my personal belongings bag. Evidence, though, of what exactly, I wasn't sure. Yet, not a crime, certainly, but something that felt equally damaging. A betrayal of trust, of the relationship I thought we had built. My children called throughout the day with cheerful voices and hollow questions about my recovery. None mentioned their inventory session. None asked if I had noticed anything missing from my room. Melissa sent flowers with a card signed from all 3 of them. Daniel texted that he was swamped at work, but thinking of me. Rebecca sent a chatty voice message about wedding plans, as if nothing unusual had happened. I responded politely, giving no indication that I had witnessed their premature estate planning. Something inside me had shifted, like a foundation cracking silently beneath a seemingly solid house. No rumble, no dramatic collapse, just the quiet realization that everything was fundamentally unstable. The nurse came in to check my vitals and found me staring out the window. "You okay, honey? Pain getting worse?" I shook my head. "No, just realizing something I should have seen a long time ago." She patted my hand sympathetically, assuming I was processing the reality of my health condition. But I wasn't thinking about the surgery or the recovery ahead. I was thinking about trust funds, about wills, about the careful financial structures Richard had created for our children, and about the phone call I needed to make as soon as I was discharged. 3 days later, I was released from the hospital. Melissa offered to let me stay with her family during my recovery, an invitation that now seemed less like concern and more like an opportunity to continue her inventory. I declined politely, saying I would be more comfortable in my own home. Daniel offered to help organize my paperwork while I recovered. Again, I declined. Rebecca suggested she could go through my closets to find comfortable clothes for my recovery period. I thanked her but said I had everything I needed. I hired a home health aide instead, Carmen, a competent, warm-hearted woman who helped me with daily tasks while respecting my privacy. The children seemed surprised by this decision. "That's so expensive, Mom," Melissa pointed out with poorly disguised irritation. "We could have helped for free." "I'm fortunate to be able to afford good care," I replied simply. What I didn't say was that I now understood the cost of their free help. Once settled at home, with Carmen ensuring I took my medications and followed the doctor's recovery protocol, I made a phone call I had been contemplating since that moment in the hospital. Jim Patterson, our family attorney for over 20 years, answered on the second ring. "Margaret, I heard about the surgery. How are you feeling?" "Well enough to have a serious conversation, Jim," I said. "I need to make some changes to certain financial arrangements. When can we meet?" There was a brief pause. "Is everything all right?" "No," I answered honestly. "But it will be. I just need to make some adjustments while I have clarity." Jim came to my home the next day, briefcase in hand, concern evident on his face. He had handled all our legal matters since before the children were born. He had drafted our wills, established the trust funds, managed the estate after Richard died. If anyone understood the full picture of our family's finances, it was Jim. We sat in my sunroom away from Carmen's caring but curious ears. I told him everything, finding the children dividing my possessions, their questions before surgery, the yellow legal pad I had kept as evidence. I showed it to him, watching his expression shift from professional neutrality to genuine dismay. "I'm so sorry, Margaret," he said finally. "This must be incredibly painful." It is, I admitted. But more than pain, I feel clarity. For the first time in years, I see my children as they are, not as I wished them to be, and I need to respond accordingly. I explained what I wanted to do, not out of vengeance, not to punish, but to protect myself, and perhaps, in some deeper way, to teach them one final lesson about consequences. Jim listened carefully, occasionally asking questions to clarify my intentions. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "It's within your legal rights," he confirmed. Richard structured the trust funds with considerable flexibility, anticipating that circumstances might change as the children grew. The remaining portions haven't been distributed yet, so adjustments can be made. And my will? As the primary estate holder, you have complete authority to revise it as you see fit. Will they be able to contest it? Jim considered this. They can try, but given the circumstances and your clear mental competence, they would have very little ground to stand on, especially if we document your reasoning carefully. I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and resolution. Then, let's proceed. I want everything properly documented, legally ironclad. I'm not doing this impulsively, Jim. I've given this a great deal of thought. I understand, he said, opening his briefcase and removing several documents. Let's start with the trust funds. For the next 3 hours, we worked methodically through the changes. Jim taking careful notes, explaining implications, drafting preliminary documents for me to review. By the time he left, promising to have the final paperwork ready within the week, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or triumph, but a quiet sense of reclaiming control over what was rightfully mine. My possessions, my money, my dignity. The children visited sporadically during my recovery, always with bright smiles and convenient excuses about why they couldn't stay longer. I welcomed them politely, offered them tea, asked about their lives with genuine interest. I didn't confront them about the legal pad or their premature division of my belongings. I didn't mention my meeting with Jim or the changes I was making. I simply observed them with new eyes, noting the way Melissa's gaze lingered on my jewelry box, how Daniel assessed the artwork on my walls with a calculating expression, how Rebecca ran her fingers over the antique side table as if already imagining it in her home. 2 weeks after my surgery, I received a call from my doctor. The pathology report had come back. The tumor was benign. I would need follow-up appointments but no further treatment. I should make a full recovery. When I shared this news with my children, their responses were telling. Beneath the expressed relief was a poorly concealed disappointment, as if a timeline they had been counting on had suddenly been extended indefinitely. "That's wonderful, Mom," Melissa said, her voice bright but strained. "So you'll be back to normal soon? No need to make any changes to your lifestyle?" "No changes necessary," I assured her, not mentioning that the most significant changes had already been made, just not the ones she was hoping for. The paperwork from Jim arrived the following Monday. 3 identical envelopes containing the amended trust fund documents, each requiring my signature to finalize the changes. A 4th, thicker envelope contained my revised will. I read through everything carefully, making sure each detail aligned with my intentions. Then I signed my name on every indicated line, my handwriting steady and deliberate. No hesitation, no second thoughts. I called Jim to let him know the documents were ready for his final review. "I'll send my assistant to pick them up tomorrow," he said. "Are you still certain about this, Margaret?" "Completely," I replied. "More certain than I've been about anything in a long time." That night, I slept more peacefully than I had since the surgery. Not because I took pleasure in what I had done, but because for the first time in years, I had made a decision based solely on truth rather than illusion. I had seen my children clearly, acknowledged the reality of who they had become, and responded, not with blind maternal indulgence, but with clear-eyed assessment. The next morning, Jim's assistant arrived to collect the signed documents. As I handed over the envelopes, I felt a weight lifting, not just the physical burden of the papers leaving my hands, but the emotional burden of unwarranted trust. By noon, Jim had called to confirm receipt and informed me that all changes were officially in process. Within 24 hours, the amendments to the trust funds would be legally binding. The children remained unaware. They continued their occasional visits, their transparent inquiries about my health disguising deeper questions about my assets. I maintained the same warm demeanor, the same maternal concern for their lives and happiness. But inside, where they couldn't see, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer the endlessly giving mother they had taken for granted. I was a woman who had finally recognized her own worth. One evening, about a month after my surgery, all 3 children arrived for dinner, an unusual occurrence that immediately triggered my suspicion. They came bearing gifts. Melissa brought an expensive scarf I would never wear. Daniel brought a bottle of wine I couldn't drink while on medication. And Rebecca brought a framed photograph of the 4 of us from years ago, when they were still teenagers and I still believed in the family we presented to the world. As we sat around the dining table, picking at the meal Carmen had prepared before leaving for the evening, their agenda slowly emerged. Subtle questions about my recovery led to concerned comments about the size of my house. "It's so much to maintain, Mom," Rebecca said. "Wouldn't you be happier somewhere smaller?" "More manageable," Daniel added quickly, "given your health concerns." "Preventative," Melissa chimed in, "before another health scare makes decisions for you." I smiled, taking a small sip of water. "I appreciate your concern," I said calmly, "but I'm quite comfortable here. This house holds so many memories for me." "Memories are portable, Mom," Rebecca said with forced lightness. "You'd take them with you to a smaller place." "But not all my possessions would fit in a smaller place," I observed. "I suppose I'd have to decide what to do with the excess." They exchanged quick glances, too quick to hide their interest. "We could help with that," Melissa offered, "sorting through things, deciding what's essential." "The way you were helping in the hospital?" I asked, my voice still pleasant, but my gaze direct. "With the yellow legal pad and the 3 columns?" The silence that followed was absolute. Their faces froze in expressions of shocked recognition, then morphed rapidly through surprise, embarrassment, and calculated recovery. Daniel was the first to find his voice. "That was just, we were trying to be prepared, in case things went differently." "We were scared," Rebecca added, her eyes wide with manufactured innocence. "People do strange things when they're afraid of losing someone they love." Melissa, ever the attorney, took a more practical approach. "It was premature and thoughtless. Mom, we apologize, but honestly, having those conversations eventually would be responsible. Not now, of course, but someday." I nodded slowly, absorbing their justifications without comment. Then I rose from the table and walked to the small secretary desk in the corner of the dining room. From the drawer, I removed the yellow legal pad they thought had remained hidden in the hospital. I returned to the table and placed it between us, its damning columns visible to all. "I found this interesting reading during my recovery," I said, "particularly the detailed notes about items I didn't realize you had been cataloging. My mother's diamond earrings, Melissa, the painting in my bedroom that Rebecca already measured to fit her living room wall, Dad's watch collection that Daniel has apparently researched the market value of." They stared at the pad, then at each other, then at me. No one spoke. "What I found most illuminating," I continued, "was the note at the bottom about my financial assets and how to divide them once access is available." "Were you planning to discuss that division with me? Or was that also something to be decided while I was unconscious?" "Mom," Melissa began, her tone shifting to the one she used in courtrooms. You're misinterpreting. I held up my hand, silencing her with a gesture I had used since they were children throwing tantrums in grocery stores. I'm not angry, I said, which wasn't entirely true. I'm disappointed, which I know sounds like a cliché, but it's accurate. I'm disappointed that after everything we've been through as a family, after all the sacrifices and support, this is how you view me, as a collection of assets to be divided rather than as your mother. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but I had seen her cry on command since she was 5 years old to get out of trouble. Daniel looked at his plate, his jaw tight. Melissa maintained eye contact, her expression carefully composed to convey remorse, without admitting wrongdoing, a skill I imagined served her well in professional negotiations. What matters now, I said, folding the legal pad and setting it aside, is how we move forward from here. I've made some decisions during my recovery that I think will help clarify our relationship going forward. What kind of decisions? Daniel asked, unable to hide the nervous edge in his voice. I smiled gently. The kind that reflect the reality of our situation rather than the illusion I've been maintaining. The kind that acknowledge what's important to each of you, based on your own demonstrated priorities. They exchanged glances again, uncertainty replacing calculation in their expressions. For the first time since they were children, I had said something they couldn't immediately interpret or manipulate to their advantage. I had changed the rules of a game they thought they understood completely. I think it's getting late, I said, standing up to signal the end of dinner. We can discuss this another time, when everyone's had a chance to reflect. Thank you for coming, and for your concern about my living arrangements. I'll certainly give it the consideration it deserves. They left reluctantly, confused by the unresolved conversation, unsure of what had just happened or what would come next. As I closed the door behind them, I felt neither triumph nor sorrow, just the quiet certainty that comes from finally seeing truth clearly and responding to it. Appropriately, the next phase had begun, not with shouting or accusations, but with the simple acknowledgement of reality and the boundary it necessarily created. I returned to the dining room and gathered the dishes, moving slowly, still mindful of my healing body. As I rinsed each plate and placed it in the dishwasher, I thought about the calls that would inevitably come tomorrow, the demands for explanation, the attempts to rewrite the narrative, the injured protestations of love and concern. I was ready for all of it. For the first time in decades, I was seeing my children not as extensions of myself or receptacles for my hopes, but as the adults they had chosen to become. Adults who had looked at their unconscious mother and seen not a person to protect, but possessions to acquire. The knowledge was painful, but the clarity it brought was worth the cost. That night, as I prepared for bed, I glanced at the photograph Rebecca had brought, the 4 of us smiling at a lakeside vacation 15 years ago, shortly before Richard died. We looked happy, connected, like a family that would stand together through anything. Perhaps we had been that family once, perhaps not. Either way, that image no longer reflected our reality, and pretending otherwise served none of us. I placed the photograph in my bedside drawer rather than displaying it. Some memories are best kept private, not because they're shameful, but because they belong to a version of life that no longer exists. I turned out the light and settled against my pillows, aware that tomorrow would bring confrontation but no longer afraid of it. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, it was honest. And honesty, even when painful, provides firmer ground than the most comforting illusion. I had raised my children to be independent adults capable of making their own choices. Now I was allowing them to experience the consequences of those choices. It wasn't punishment. It was, perhaps, the last and most important lesson I could teach them about the true meaning of family, of trust, of love that demands accountability rather than endless, unquestioning sacrifice. As I drifted toward sleep, I felt a strange peace settling over me. Not happiness, not vindication, but the quiet recognition that sometimes love requires difficult truths. And sometimes, those truths change everything. The phone calls began at 8:17 the next morning, exactly as I had anticipated. My cell phone lit up with Melissa's name, followed immediately by text messages from Daniel and Rebecca. I let them all go to voicemail, not out of pettiness, but because I needed to maintain the clarity I had finally achieved. After decades of responding immediately to my children's needs, I gave myself permission to respond on my own timeline. A small act of reclamation, but significant. I spent the morning in my garden instead, carefully tending to the rose bushes Richard and I had planted when we first moved into this house 32 years ago. The physical activity was good for my recovery, the doctor had said. The mental peace it provided was something I had discovered on my own. There was honesty in gardening. Plants responded directly to the care they received, without manipulation or hidden agendas. Neglect them, and they withered. Nurture them properly, and they thrived. The roses didn't care about inheritance or jewelry or antique furniture. They simply existed in a straightforward relationship with their caretaker. By mid-morning, I had missed 12 calls and 27 text messages. I brushed the soil from my gardening gloves, took a long shower, and finally picked up my phone. I called Jim first, wanting to confirm everything was proceeding as planned. The amendments are all processed, he assured me. Legally binding? As of yesterday afternoon, I've also updated your will according to your instructions. Everything is in order, Margaret. Have you heard from any of the children? I asked. He hesitated briefly. Melissa called the office this morning, said she wanted to discuss some family financial matters on your behalf. I explained that I could only speak with you directly about your affairs. How did she respond to that? Not well, Jim admitted. She mentioned something about your recent health issues potentially affecting your judgment. I laughed softly, without humor. Convenient timing for that concern. Margaret, Jim's voice took on the careful tone of a longtime family friend, rather than just an attorney. Are you prepared for their reaction when they find out? I'm not sure anyone can be fully prepared for something like this, I replied honestly. But I'm certain about my decision. That will have to be enough. After ending the call with Jim, I scrolled through my messages. They followed a predictable pattern, concern evolving into confusion, then frustration, and finally, thinly veiled, demands for callbacks. I texted each of them the same message. I'm feeling well enough for visitors this evening at 7. We can discuss everything then. The responses were immediate. All three confirmed they would be there. I spent the afternoon preparing, not in the frantic way I once would have, cooking elaborate dishes, ensuring everything was perfect for their arrival. Instead, I reviewed my documentation, organized my thoughts, and centered myself for what would likely be a difficult conversation. Carmen helped me set out some simple refreshments before departing for the evening. I insisted on handling this family matter alone. They arrived separately, but within minutes of each other. Melissa first, punctual as always. Daniel second, checking his phone distractedly as he entered. Rebecca last, bearing another unnecessary gift, this time a scented candle in a frosted jar. I welcomed them calmly, directing them to the living room where I had arranged seating in a way that allowed me to face all three of them directly. You're looking better, Mom, Melissa said, her eyes assessing me for signs of weakness or confusion. More color in your cheeks. The doctor is pleased with my recovery, I replied. Physically, I'm healing exactly as expected. And otherwise? Daniel asked carefully. Otherwise, I echoed. I've been doing a great deal of thinking. About family, about trust, about the future. Rebecca leaned forward, her expression earnest. That's exactly what we want to talk about, Mom. We're worried about you being alone in this big house, especially after such a serious health scare. I understand your concern, I said. But before we discuss my living arrangements, there's something else we need to address. I reached for a folder on the side table and opened it, revealing the yellow legal pad. This list you made in my hospital room. Daniel cleared his throat. Mom, we can explain. I'm sure you can, I interrupted gently. But first, I'd like to understand something. What made you think it was appropriate to divide my possessions while I was in surgery? Not just discuss them theoretically, but actually assign them to each other? Items I still use and cherish? The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. Melissa, as usual, took the lead. We were afraid, she said, her voice slipping into the controlled empathy she likely used with difficult clients. The doctor had told us the tumor could be malignant. We were preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. It was a coping mechanism, Mom. People do strange things when they're scared. A coping mechanism, I repeated. And the conversation about downsizing my home, the questions about my will before I even went into surgery, were those coping mechanisms too? Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. You're making it sound so calculated, so cold. We love you, Mom. We were just trying to be practical. Practical, I nodded. Like when you measured my bedroom wall art. Rebecca? Or when you researched the market value of my jewelry collection, Melissa? Or when you contacted my investment advisor last month, Daniel, to inquire about the status of my accounts? Their expressions shifted from defensive to shocked. They hadn't realized how much I knew, how many pieces of the puzzle I had assembled during my recovery. How did you? Daniel began. People talk, I said simply. My investment advisor has known me for 20 years. My housekeeper notices when items are moved or measured. The hospital staff saw you with my phone, accessing my photos and contacts. Nothing stays hidden forever. I closed the folder and set it aside. But we're not here to discuss what you did. We're here to discuss what happens now. I stood up and walked to the antique secretary desk in the corner, the same one Rebecca had already claimed on their list. From the drawer, I removed 3 sealed envelopes, each bearing one of their names. I returned to my seat and held the envelopes in my lap, not yet distributing them. When your father died, he left specific instructions for your financial future. The trust funds he established were designed to support you as you built your own lives, not to replace the need for your own efforts. He believed, and I agreed, that true security comes from what you build for yourself, not what's handed to you. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. Daniel's attention was suddenly completely focused on me rather than his phone. Rebecca had stopped crying, her expression wary. Those trust funds were structured to distribute in portions, at 25, at 30, and the remainder at 35. As you know, Melissa has received her full amount. Daniel has received 2 portions, with the final disbursement scheduled for his 35th birthday next year. Rebecca has received her first portion, with 2 more scheduled over the next 6 years. I paused, allowing the information to settle in the room. They already knew all of this, of course, but the context was important for what came next. What you may not know is that your father built in certain provisions that gave me, as the surviving parent, flexibility to adjust the terms under specific circumstances. He trusted my judgment about our children's best interests, even if that meant making difficult decisions. Daniel leaned forward, his financial mind clearly running calculations. What kind of adjustments? Instead of answering directly, I handed each of them their envelope. These documents explain the changes I've made to your respective trust arrangements. I've had considerable time to think about this, and I believe these adjustments better reflect our current family dynamic. They tore into the envelopes with varying degrees of restraint. Melissa with controlled precision. Daniel with barely contained urgency. Rebecca with nervous fingers that fumbled with the seal. As they read, Their expressions transformed in near unison from curiosity to disbelief to something approaching panic. "You've frozen the remainder of our trust funds?" Melissa's voice was dangerously quiet. "Not frozen," I corrected. "Redirected. The remaining funds that would have been distributed to each of you have been restructured into a new trust." "A charitable trust?" Daniel was scanning the document frantically. "For medical research and patient support services?" "Yes," I confirmed. "The Elizabeth Margaret Foundation, named after my mother. It will fund research into the type of tumor I had removed, as well as provide financial support for patients who don't have the resources I've been fortunate enough to have." Rebecca was still staring at her paper, her complexion pale. "But what about our disbursements? My next portion was going to help with the wedding and the down payment on our house." "The portions you've already received remain yours," I explained. "You've each had significant advantages already. College educations I helped fund, down payments on first homes, generous wedding contributions for Melissa, and soon for you, Rebecca. The remaining trust funds, however, will serve a different purpose now." "Can she do this?" Daniel directed his question to Melissa, the attorney in the family. Melissa was already flipping through the pages, searching for loopholes. "There must be conditions, limitations. Dad wouldn't have given her complete control without safeguards. Your father," I said quietly, "trusted my judgment. He believed I would always act in the best interest of our family. And that's exactly what I'm doing." "By punishing us?" Daniel's voice rose, his face flushing with anger. "By taking away what Dad intended for us to have?" "By responding to the reality of our situation," I corrected him. "You divided my possessions while I was in surgery. I've divided the remaining trust funds while you were unaware." The symmetry seemed appropriate. "This is completely different," Melissa protested. "We didn't actually take anything. We were just planning." "As was I replied evenly. "Just planning. The difference is, I've implemented my plan." The room fell silent as they absorbed the magnitude of what had happened. Years of anticipated financial windfalls had evaporated in a single evening, redirected to strangers they would never meet. Patients who would benefit from research into a condition that, for my children, had represented not a health crisis, but a potential inheritance opportunity. "There's more," I said, nodding toward the documents they held. "If you continue reading, you'll see that I've also revised my will and estate plan." They turned the pages with visible trepidation. As they read, the color drained from their faces. "You're leaving the house to Carmen's family?" Rebecca's voice cracked with disbelief. "To Carmen's daughter specifically," I clarified. "She's a single mother with 3 children, putting herself through nursing school. Carmen has worked for me for years, always with dignity and respect. Her daughter needs stability more than any of you do." "And the artwork, the jewelry, the furniture?" Daniel demanded. "Most of it will be sold, with the proceeds going to the Elizabeth Margaret Foundation," I explained. "I've kept small personal bequests for each of you, items with particular family significance rather than monetary value. Those are detailed on page 4. Melissa was already there, reading aloud in a hollow voice. To Melissa, my grandmother's handwritten recipe book and the family photo albums. She looked up sharply. "That's it? Recipes and photos?" "To Daniel," he read from his own document. "My collection of letters from your father during our courtship, and the chess set he taught you to play on." His hands were shaking now. "A chess set? Instead of the investments and property?" "To Rebecca," she whispered, "my watercolor supplies and the unfinished paintings in my studio, along with my journals documenting our family history." She looked up, tears streaming now. "Mom, why are you doing this? We made a mistake, but this is extreme." I leaned forward, meeting each of their gazes in turn. Is it extreme? You were dividing my possessions without my knowledge or consent, while I was still using them, still cherishing them. You were planning my downsizing, my diminishment, my erasure from my own home before I had even received my diagnosis. Tell me, what would have been an appropriate response to that level of disregard? None of them answered immediately. The reality of their actions, reflected back through my response, seemed to finally penetrate their defensive shell. We didn't mean, Rebecca began. Intentions matter less than actions, I interrupted gently. What you intended doesn't change what you did, or how it made me feel when I saw that yellow pad. So this is revenge, Daniel said flatly. An eye for an eye. I shook my head slowly. No, Daniel, this isn't revenge. It's a consequence, and more importantly, it's a boundary. For too long, I've allowed each of you to take without reciprocating, to receive without gratitude, to expect without earning. That ends now. You can't just rewrite the rules of our relationship overnight, Melissa protested, though with less conviction than before. I haven't, I replied. I've simply acknowledged the rules you've already been operating under and adjusted my behavior accordingly. If my belongings are simply assets to be divided, then so are the trust funds. If my home is just real estate to be reallocated, then it can be reallocated to someone who genuinely needs it. The silence that followed was profound. For perhaps the first time in their adult lives, my children were confronting a version of me they didn't know how to manipulate or manage. A mother who had set a boundary and enforced it without anger, but with absolute clarity. Is this final? Rebecca asked eventually, her voice small. The legal changes are final, yes, I confirmed. The documents have been filed and processed. The trust restructuring is complete. The will has been updated and witnessed. And our relationship? Melissa asked, her attorney's composure cracking slightly to reveal the daughter beneath. Is that final too? The question hung in the air between us. It was the right question finally, not about the money or possessions, but about the fractured trust between us. I considered my answer carefully. That, I said slowly, depends on what happens next. On whether you can accept that our relationship needs to be rebuilt on different terms. On whether you can see me as a person of value beyond what I can give you materially. Of course we value you, Daniel insisted, though his eyes kept drifting back to the document in his hands. I believe you think that's true, I said, but your actions tell a different story. Actions like making inventory lists in hospital rooms and measuring artwork while I recover. So what do we do now? Rebecca asked, genuine confusion in her voice. She had always been the most direct of my children, the least strategic. Now, I said, we begin again. Without the expectation of inheritance or financial gain. Without the assumption that my primary value is in what I can provide. We learn to be a family based on mutual respect rather than anticipation of future assets. They exchanged glances, clearly struggling to process this fundamental shift. For their entire adult lives, they had operated with the certainty of financial security nets beneath them. Those nets were now gone, redirected toward strangers with medical needs rather than children with entitled expectations. I should go, Melissa said finally, standing abruptly. Stephen will be wondering where I am. The kids have school tomorrow. Daniel followed suit, muttering about an early meeting. Rebecca lingered longest, her artistic temperament always more comfortable with emotional complexity than her siblings. Mom, she said quietly when the others had left, did we really hurt you that badly? The simple honesty of the question caught me off guard. For a moment, I saw a glimmer of the sensitive child she had once been, before ambition and social climbing had hardened her edges. Yes, I answered truthfully. You did. Not because of the money or the possessions, but because you were so quick to erase me from my own life, to reduce me to a collection of items to be claimed rather than a mother to be cherished. She nodded, slowly, absorbing this. I don't know how to fix that. Neither do I admitted. But recognizing it happened is a start. After she left, I sat alone in the quiet house, surrounded by the possessions my children had been so eager to claim. The antique desk with its delicate inlay work, the watercolor from our Lake Tahoe vacation, the crystal vase Richard had given me on our 25th anniversary. Beautiful things, meaningful things, but just things. Not worth the broken trust their premature division had revealed. I made myself a cup of tea and carried it to the back porch, settling into the wicker chair that had been my favorite spot for morning reflection since the children were small. The garden was peaceful in the evening light. The roses I had tended, that morning glowing softly in the dusk. For the first time since finding that yellow legal pad, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened, what had been revealed, what had been lost. The tears came quietly, without drama, just the steady release of a grief too profound for words. I wasn't mourning the redirected trust funds or the revised will. I was mourning the family I thought we were, the relationships I had believed in, the love I had taken for granted. It was a deeper loss than anything material could represent, the loss of illusion, of comforting fiction, of the narrative that had sustained me through decades of giving. Yet beneath the grief was something unexpected, a sense of liberation, of boundaries finally established, of truth finally acknowledged. I had spent so many years being defined primarily as their mother, their support system, their safety net. Now I was reclaiming the woman who existed beyond those roles. Margaret Elizabeth Harrington, not just mother to Melissa, Daniel, and Rebecca, but a person in her own right, with needs and dignity and limits that deserved respect. As darkness settled over the garden, I finished my tea and went inside. I had no idea what tomorrow would bring. Angry phone calls, legal threats, tearful apologies, or stony silence. But for the first time in years, I wasn't arranging my life around anticipating and meeting my children's needs. I was simply living as myself, making decisions based on clear-eyed assessment rather than maternal obligation or wishful thinking. That night, I slept deeply and without dreams, my body continuing its physical healing while my spirit began a different kind of recovery. The slow, necessary reclamation of self that comes when you finally stop giving away pieces of your soul to people who don't recognize their value. The next morning brought silence. No calls, no texts, no surprise visits. I found myself relieved rather than concerned. The quiet gave me space to continue my internal realignment, to adjust to this new reality where my relationship with my children was fundamentally changed. Carmen arrived at 10, bringing fresh flowers and a gentle smile. "You look better today, Mrs. Harrington," she observed as she arranged the blooms in a crystal vase, ironically, one of the items Melissa had claimed on the hospital list. More peaceful. "I feel more peaceful," I admitted, like I've set down a heavy burden I didn't realize I was carrying. She nodded, her dark eyes wise and understanding. "Sometimes the heaviest burdens are the ones we don't even know we have, the expectations we never question." I smiled, grateful for her perceptiveness. "Carmen, there's something I should tell you, something that will affect your family." I explained the changes to my will, watching her expression shift from polite attention to disbelief. "Mrs. Harrington," she gasped when I finished. "The house? For Maria? This is too much. We cannot accept such generosity." "It's not generosity, Carmen. It's recognition. Recognition of the dignity and respect you've always shown me. Of the hard work your daughter is doing to create a better life for her children. The house should go to someone who will fill it with genuine family love, not someone who sees it as a real estate asset." Carmen wiped away tears. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," I assured her. "The changes are made and they feel right. More right than anything I've done in a very long time. The silence from my children lasted 3 days, precisely the amount of time it took them to consult with attorneys of their own and discover that my actions, while shocking to them, were entirely legal. Melissa was the first to break the silence, calling on Thursday morning with a voice that attempted professional detachment but couldn't quite hide the tremor of anger beneath. "Mom, I've spoken with a colleague who specializes in estate law," she began without preamble. "He suggests we meet to discuss potential compromises regarding the trust modifications." "I'm not interested in compromise, Melissa," I replied calmly. "The changes reflect my considered decision." "You're being unreasonable," she said, her composure slipping slightly. "This isn't just about some misunderstanding in a hospital room. This is our future, our security." "Your future and security were never meant to depend on an inheritance," I reminded her. "Your father and I gave you every advantage: education, connections, initial financial support. The rest was always meant to be supplementary, not foundational." "That's easy for you to say from your comfortable position," she snapped, "with your paid-off house and retirement accounts." "Comfort I earned through decades of work and careful saving," I pointed out. "Just as you've had every opportunity to build your own security through your successful legal career." The conversation ended with Melissa's terse goodbye and the unmistakable sound of her composure finally cracking, a sharp intake of breath that might have been the beginning of a sob, cut off by the call disconnecting. I sat with the phone in my hand for several minutes afterward, surprised by my own steadiness. There was sadness, certainly, but not the crushing guilt I would have expected even a few weeks ago. Something fundamental had changed within me. Daniel's approach was more calculated. He arrived unannounced that afternoon, dressed in the expensive suit he wore for important client meetings, armed with spreadsheets and financial projections. "I've run the numbers, Mom," he said, spreading papers across my kitchen table without asking permission. "If you redirect just half of the remaining trust funds instead of the full amount, you could still make a significant charitable impact while preserving some of our intended inheritance." I studied him for a moment. My middle child, always the strategist, always looking for the angle, the compromise, the deal to be struck. In another context, his persistence might have been admirable. Now it just underscored how little he understood what had happened. "This isn't a negotiation, Daniel," I said gently. "The decision is made. The funds have been transferred. But there must be a way to undo it, to revise the terms again," he insisted, tapping at a column of figures with his Mont Blanc pen, a Christmas gift from me 2 years earlier. "Look, I've calculated the tax implications of various scenarios. There's a way to structure this that benefits everyone." "I understand you're disappointed," I acknowledged, "but I need you to understand something important. This isn't about the money. It's about recognizing that our relationship had become fundamentally unbalanced. I was seen as a resource rather than a person. That needed to change." He sat back, frustration evident in the tight line of his mouth. "So you're teaching us a lesson? Like we're children who misbehaved?" "No," I said. "I'm establishing a boundary as one adult to another. There's a significant difference. A boundary that costs us millions," he muttered. "A boundary that might help us rebuild something more valuable than money: trust, respect, genuine connection. But only if you can see beyond the financial loss to the relationship that's at stake." Daniel gathered his spreadsheets with quick, angry movements. "I've got clients who treat me with more consideration than this," he said, his voice low and hurt. "Clients who understand the importance of financial security. I hope those clients also understand the importance of integrity," I replied, "of seeing people as more than the assets they control." He left without another word, his expensive car peeling out of the driveway with unnecessary force. I watched him go, feeling the strange mixture of sadness and resolution that had become familiar over the past week. Rebecca's response came last and took a different form entirely. Rather than confrontation or negotiation, she sent a text message that simply read, "I understand what you did and why. I'm sorry we hurt you. Can we talk?" I invited her for tea the following afternoon. When she arrived, she looked different than she had at our family dinner. Less polished, more authentic, her artistic nature showing through in her uncombed hair and paint-smudged jeans. "I've been in my studio all week," she explained, seeing my glance at her appearance. "Painting helps me think." We sat in the sunroom, cups of Earl Grey steaming between us. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't comfortable. Exactly. But it wasn't hostile either. It held possibility. "I read the documents you gave us," she said finally, "about the Elizabeth Margaret Foundation. It's actually beautiful what you're doing. Helping patients who don't have the resources we've always taken for granted." I studied her face, searching for manipulation and finding, to my surprise, what appeared to be genuine reflection. "I spoke with a lawyer, too," she continued. "Like Melissa and Daniel did, but not about fighting your decision. I just wanted to understand exactly what you'd done and why it was legal." She paused, twisting a silver ring around her finger nervously. "The lawyer explained about Dad's provisions, about the control he left you. And it made me realize something. I should have known all along. He trusted your judgment about us more than he trusted our judgment about ourselves." The insight startled me. In all my considerations, I hadn't articulated this truth quite so clearly, yet Rebecca had grasped it immediately. "Your father believed in giving you opportunities," I said carefully, "but he never wanted to remove the necessity of effort, of earning your own way." Rebecca nodded. "The trust funds were a boost, not a replacement for building our own lives." She looked down at her tea. "I've been thinking about the hospital, about that stupid list, about how we've been acting for years, really, if I'm honest with myself. Taking you for granted, assuming your support, emotional, financial, everything would always be there, unconditional and unlimited. And now," I prompted when she fell silent, "now I realize that even love has limits. That's what you're showing us, isn't it? That loving us doesn't mean letting us treat you as less than you are." For the first time since discovering the yellow pad, I felt a flicker of hope. Not that my financial decisions would be reversed, but that perhaps something valuable might emerge from this painful revelation. Rebecca had always been the most emotionally intuitive of my children, the one most capable of genuine empathy beneath her sometimes self-absorbed exterior. "Love without boundaries isn't actually healthy," I agreed, "for either party. I enabled patterns that weren't good for any of us. That's my responsibility, and I'm correcting it now. By taking away the money," she said, not accusingly but thoughtfully. "By removing the expectation of unearned reward," I clarified. "By creating consequences for actions that revealed concerning values." Rebecca set down her cup with deliberate care. "I don't like it," she admitted. "I was counting on that money, especially for the house deposit. Jordan and I will have to completely reconsider our plans." She met my eyes directly. "But I think I understand it. And maybe we needed this wake-up call." After she left, I found myself more emotionally drained than after either of my confrontations with her siblings. Anger was easier to withstand than vulnerable honesty. Rebecca's willingness to see beyond her own disappointment had touched something in me I had carefully protected during this process. The wounded heart of a mother who still, despite everything, loved her children and wished for their growth rather than their punishment. The following week brought practical developments. Jim called to inform me that the Elizabeth Margaret Foundation was now officially established, with a board of directors comprised of medical professionals and patient advocates. The redirected trust funds were being put to immediate use, funding, research at 3 hospitals, and providing financial support to patients in need. The first grants have already been distributed, he told me. A single mother with the same type of tumor you had. She couldn't afford to take time off work for her recovery. The foundation is covering her living expenses for 3 months so she can focus on healing. The news filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't anticipated when making these decisions. What had begun as a response to betrayal was transforming into something independently meaningful. A legacy that honored not just my mother's name, but the values I hoped to reinforce. I asked Jim to send me regular updates about the foundation's work. Not to share with my children as evidence of the good their lost inheritance was doing, that would be manipulative in its own way, but for my own sense of connection to this unexpected new chapter of my life. Melissa and Daniel maintained their distance, communicating only through terse texts about practical matters or via attorneys with increasingly unrealistic proposals for compromise solutions. I responded to the former with polite brevity and to the latter through Jim, who firmly but professionally reinforced that the matter was legally settled. Rebecca, however, began a tentative rebuilding. She invited me to her studio to see her latest work, a series of abstract paintings that captured emotional transitions with surprising depth. She asked about my recovery, not in the calculating way she had before the surgery, but with genuine concern for my well-being. Small steps, hesitant but sincere. Jordan and I are looking at smaller houses, she told me during one visit. Further from the city center, older properties we can renovate gradually. It's actually exciting in a way, thinking about building something that's truly ours, not just purchased with handed-down money. I heard echoes of Richard in her words, his belief in the dignity of effort, the satisfaction of earning rather than receiving. Perhaps something of our values had taken root in her after all, beneath the entitled exterior that modern society had helped cultivate. 1 month after the trust fund revelations, I received an unexpected call from Stephen, Melissa's husband. We had always maintained a cordial but distant relationship. He was ambitious like my daughter, their marriage a partnership of compatible goals rather than passionate connection. "Margaret," he began awkwardly, "I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. Melissa doesn't know I'm calling." "Is everything all right, Stephen?" I asked, immediately concerned about my grandchildren. "The kids are fine," he assured me quickly. "It's about Melissa. This situation with the trust funds, it's affected her deeply. Not just financially, but something deeper. I've never seen her so shaken." I waited, not offering easy reassurance or quick solutions. He continued hesitantly. "She won't talk about it directly, but I've heard her on the phone with her therapist. She keeps saying she didn't see her mother as a person, and now she's questioning everything, our values, how we're raising the kids, what we're teaching them about family." The revelation surprised me. Melissa in therapy, questioning her values. This was unexpected territory. "I'm not asking you to change your decision," Stephen clarified. "To be honest, after hearing some of Melissa's realizations, I'm not sure it would even be helpful if you did, but I thought you should know that something's happening with her. Something that might be important." After Stephen's call, I found myself revisiting memories of Melissa as a child, fiercely independent even at 5 years old, determined to tie her own shoes, make her own bed, solve her own problems. Her self-sufficiency had been a point of pride for Richard and me. We'd never fully recognized how that independence might calcify into isolation, how her determination to handle everything herself might make her incapable of genuine vulnerability or connection. Had our parenting contributed to the very qualities that now created this distance? Had we inadvertently taught our children that performance mattered more than presence, achievement more than authenticity? These questions lingered as I continued my physical recovery, gaining strength daily while navigating the emotional aftermath of my decision. 6 weeks after surgery, I received a clean bill of health from my doctor. The tumor was completely benign, he confirmed. Your recovery has been textbook perfect. I don't need to see you again for 6 months, just for routine follow-up. I celebrated this news quietly, calling only Rebecca to share it. She offered to come over with dinner that evening, another small gesture in our gradual reconstruction. I accepted, finding myself looking forward to her company in a way I wouldn't have expected weeks earlier. As I was preparing the dining room for our meal, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. When I opened the front door, I found Daniel standing on the porch, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. His usual polished appearance had given way to wrinkled clothes and uncombed hair. His eyes were bloodshot. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice rough. I stepped aside wordlessly, concerned by his appearance. He entered but didn't move toward the living room, instead standing awkwardly in the foyer, hands shoved in his pockets. "I got fired yesterday," he said abruptly. This was the last thing I had expected. Daniel had always been successful professionally, his ambition and sharp financial mind carrying him quickly up the corporate ladder. "What happened?" I asked, genuinely shocked. He ran a hand through his hair, making it stand up even more chaotically. "I made some aggressive investment moves. With client funds. Took risks I shouldn't have taken. I was trying to—" He trailed off, looking away. "Trying to what, Daniel?" "Trying to make up for the lost trust fund," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I thought if I could generate enough return quickly enough, I could create my own safety net to replace what I lost." The implications were immediately clear. "You risked client money to solve your personal financial situation?" He nodded miserably. "The firm found out. They had no choice but to let me go. I'm lucky they're not pressing charges, honestly." I stood very still, absorbing this unexpected consequence of my actions. I had never intended to push Daniel toward professional self-destruction. I had wanted reflection, reassessment, perhaps humility, not desperation that led to ethical compromises. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty," he said, seeming to read my thoughts. "I made my own choices, bad ones. But this whole situation has forced me to look at myself in ways I never had to before, and I don't like what I'm seeing." I gestured toward the living room. "Sit down, Daniel, please." We sat across from each other, the evening light casting long shadows across the room. For the first time in our adult relationship, the power dynamic had been completely disrupted. He wasn't the successful financier indulging his mother with occasional attention. I wasn't the supportive parent pretending his sporadic presence was enough. We were just two people facing a painful truth together. "I've been thinking about Dad a lot," he said after a long silence. "About what he would think of all this. The list in the hospital, your response, my professional choices." "What conclusions have you reached?" I asked. "He would be disappointed in me," Daniel said simply. "Not because I lost access to the trust fund. He never cared that much about money itself. But because of what my actions revealed about my character." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "He'd be proud of you, though, for refusing to be taken advantage of, for having the courage to enforce consequences." The observation struck me with unexpected force. I hadn't considered Richard's perspective on all this, hadn't thought about what he would make of the dramatic restructuring of the financial provisions he had so carefully established. But Daniel was right. Richard had never tolerated entitlement or exploitation. He had believed in earning one's way, in gratitude for advantages, in respect for those who provided them. "What will you do now?" I asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Start over, I guess. A former colleague has offered me a position at a smaller firm. Lower title, much lower salary, but a chance to rebuild my reputation." I'll have to sell the condo. Get something more modest. Scale back everything. That sounds sensible, I said, neither offering financial help nor expressing satisfaction at his reduced circumstances. This was his journey now, his opportunity to discover what he was made of without safety nets. Rebecca's coming for dinner, I told him. Would you like to join us? He hesitated, clearly surprised by the invitation. Are you sure? After everything? I'm not offering forgiveness without accountability, I clarified. I'm offering dinner with your mother and sister. It's a small step, but perhaps a place to start. The doorbell rang again before he could respond. I opened it to find Rebecca holding a takeout bag from my favorite Italian restaurant, her expression shifting to confusion when she saw Daniel behind me. Family dinner? She asked hesitantly. If that's all right with you, I replied. She nodded slowly. Actually, I invited someone too. I hope that's okay. She stepped aside to reveal Melissa standing behind her, holding a bottle of wine and looking as uncertain as I had ever seen her. I ran into her at the wine shop, Rebecca explained. We got talking and… I looked at my 3 children, gathered awkwardly on my doorstep, and felt something shift inside me. Not a return to blind maternal indulgence, but a cautious opening to possibility. They had hurt me deeply, revealed aspects of themselves I could never unsee. But they were here now, showing up without demands or expectations, simply present. Come in, I said, opening the door wider. All of you. The dinner that followed was unlike any family gathering we had experienced before. There was no pretense of perfect harmony, no glossing over difficult truths. We ate Rebecca's takeout pasta on my good china, the same china Melissa had claimed wouldn't be needed after my surgery. And the conversation moved cautiously around, essential truths none of us had previously been willing to acknowledge. Melissa spoke haltingly about her therapy sessions, about recognizing patterns of behavior she had inherited and perpetuated. Daniel shared the humbling reality of his professional setback and the soul-searching it had prompted. Rebecca described the smaller house she and Jordan had found and the unexpected creativity sparked by their new budget limitations. I listened more than I spoke, observing this unfamiliar vulnerability in my children with a mixture of surprise and tentative hope. There were no promises of behavioral transformation, no dramatic reconciliations or tearful group hugs. There was just honesty, uncomfortable, necessary honesty about who we had become and who we might choose to be moving forward. As they prepared to leave several hours later, Melissa lingered behind her siblings. When we were alone in the foyer, she spoke quietly, her usual confidence absent. The foundation, she said. The Elizabeth Margaret Foundation. I'd like to know more about it, about the patients it's helping. I studied her face, searching for calculation and finding what appeared to be genuine interest. I receive regular updates from the board, I told her. I could share them with you. She nodded. I'd appreciate that. And if they ever need legal assistance, pro bono work, advisory services, I'd like to offer my expertise. Not to regain favor, she added quickly. Just to contribute something meaningful. As I closed the door behind them, I didn't feel the triumphant vindication I might have expected when first conceiving this consequence. Nor did I feel the crushing guilt my former self might have anticipated. Instead, I experienced something more nuanced. The quiet recognition that sometimes the most painful ruptures create space for necessary rebuilding. I returned to the dining room and began clearing the dishes, moving slowly and deliberately through this familiar routine. The table where we had just shared a meal was the same table where I had confronted them with the yellow legal pad, where they had opened the envelopes revealing their lost inheritances, where years of family dinners had created an illusion of connection that had shattered in a hospital room. Tables could be many things, I reflected, surfaces for division, platforms for confrontation, or spaces for cautious new beginnings. The same was true of families. The same was true of mothers, The same was true of me. As I carefully wrapped the leftover pasta and placed it in the refrigerator, I thought about transformation, not the dramatic kind portrayed in movies, but the slow, uneven, often painful process of real human change. My children were beginning that journey, prompted by a consequence they never anticipated. I was on my own parallel path, discovering the strength that comes from standing in your truth, even when that truth disrupts every comfortable pattern of your existence. I had no illusions that one dinner had healed our fractured family. The trust funds remained redirected. The will remained revised. The yellow legal pad remained a tangible reminder of a betrayal I could never completely forget. But something had shifted tonight. Some small opening toward a different kind of relationship. One based on reality rather than expectation, on earned trust rather than assumed entitlement. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The incision from my surgery was healing well, a thin pink line that would eventually fade to a faint silver scar. Some wounds remained visible, permanent markers of trauma endured and survived. Others healed without external evidence, their presence known only to the one who carried them. Both were part of me now, the physical reminder of the tumor that had been removed, and the emotional reminder of the illusions that had been excised along with it. I placed my hand gently over the healing incision, feeling the steady beat of my heart beneath it. In that quiet moment of connection with myself, I recognized a truth that had been emerging slowly since that day in the hospital. The greatest gift I could give my children wasn't financial security or material possessions. It was the example of a woman who valued herself enough to require respect, who loved them enough to hold them accountable, who believed in their capacity to grow beyond the entitled adults they had become. Whether they would accept that gift remained to be seen. But I had offered it with clarity and purpose, and for now, that was enough. 6 months after my surgery, life had settled into new patterns that would have been unimaginable before. The seasons had changed, summer giving, way to fall, then winter, and now the first tentative signs of spring appeared in my garden. The roses I had tended during my recovery period remained dormant, but small green shoots pushed through the soil where I had planted bulbs decades ago, a reminder that renewal follows even the harshest periods of dormancy. My relationship with my children had evolved into something I could never have predicted during those raw, painful weeks after the hospital incident. Not a return to what we had been. That was impossible after such a fundamental rupture, but the careful construction of something new. Something that, while still fragile, felt more honest than what had existed before. Melissa had surprised me the most. After that first tentative family dinner, she had followed through on her offer to provide legal assistance to the Elizabeth Margaret Foundation. What began as occasional consultations had evolved into regular pro bono work, reviewing grant applications, and helping structure the foundation's growing programs. She never mentioned the redirected trust funds or asked for reconsideration of my decision. Instead, she seemed to be channeling her professional skills into something that existed beyond her personal interests. One afternoon, she arrived at my house unexpectedly, carrying a thick folder and wearing the determined expression I recognized from her childhood math competitions. "Do you have time to talk?" she asked, her usual commanding tone softened by what appeared to be genuine uncertainty. I invited her in, curious about this unscheduled visit. We sat in the sunroom, where the afternoon light created patterns across the floor through the swaying branches outside. "I've been reviewing the Foundation's outreach programs," she began, opening her folder and revealing pages of neatly organized notes. "There's a gap in services for patients with limited English proficiency. They're missing critical information about treatment options, financial assistance, even basic recovery protocols." I nodded, unsurprised by this observation. Healthcare disparities had been a concern throughout my career as a physical therapist. "I'd like to develop a multilingual patient advocacy program," Melissa continued, her voice gaining confidence as she outlined her vision. Legal assistance, translation services, cultural navigation support. I've drafted a proposal for how it could work within the Foundation's existing structure. She handed me several meticulously prepared pages: budget projections, staffing, requirements, implementation timelines. The thoroughness was characteristic of my eldest daughter, but the focus was entirely new. This wasn't about corporate clients or billable hours. This was about making essential services accessible to vulnerable people. "This is impressive, Melissa," I said sincerely. "What prompted your interest in this particular aspect of patient care?" She was quiet for a moment, arranging and rearranging her papers in a nervous gesture I hadn't seen since her law school admissions interviews. "I met one of the Foundation's grant recipients last month," she finally said. "A woman from Guatemala. Single mother of 3 like you were. She had the same type of tumor, but her experience was so different from yours. No family support, language barriers, financial instability. It made me realize how much I've taken for granted, not just the material advantages, but the invisible ones. The ability to understand what doctors are saying, the knowledge of how systems work." She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "I've spent my career helping wealthy people navigate systems that already favor them. I'm good at it, but maybe those skills could matter more elsewhere." The revelation stunned me. This was a side of Melissa I had glimpsed only rarely. The compassionate core beneath the ambitious exterior, the capacity for empathy that her competitive professional environment rarely rewarded. "The Foundation would be fortunate to have this program," I told her. "I'll make sure the board reviews your proposal immediately." She nodded, but didn't move to leave. "There's something else," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "I've been thinking about making a career change. A law firm that specializes in healthcare advocacy has approached me. The salary would be significantly lower than what I make now, but the work would be more aligned with what I'm starting to think matters." "That's a substantial shift," I observed, careful not to push or influence her decision. This was her journey now, her process of recalibration. "It is," she agreed. "Stephen supports it, surprisingly. He says I've been different since." She gestured vaguely, not needing to specify the hospital incident and its aftermath. "More present with the kids, less obsessed with partner-track politics. Happier, actually." "And are you?" I asked. "Happier?" She considered this thoughtfully. "Not exactly happier. More. Awake? Like I've been sleepwalking through a life that checked all the right boxes but didn't actually fit who I am." She shook her head slightly. "That sounds ridiculous coming from a 40-year-old woman." "It's never too late to wake up," I said quietly. "To question whether the path you're on is taking you where you truly want to go." Melissa gathered her papers with deliberate movements. "I used to think I knew exactly where I was going. Corner, office, managing partner, vacation home in the Hamptons. Now I'm not sure of anything except that I want my children to see me as more than a provider of things. I want them to know me as a person who contributes something meaningful." As she left that day, I watched her walk to her car with a sense of wonder. The daughter who had once methodically inventoried my jewelry collection was now creating programs to support vulnerable patients. The shift wasn't complete. Melissa would always be ambitious, always strategic. But the focus of that ambition was evolving in ways I couldn't have orchestrated or demanded. It was coming from within her, sparked perhaps by the consequence I had imposed, but fueled by her own emerging values. Daniel's transformation took a different path. The professional setback he had experienced, being fired for ethical violations, had forced a reckoning he might otherwise have avoided indefinitely. The smaller firm that hired him placed him under strict supervision, limiting his client contact and decision-making authority. It was a humbling position for someone who had once managed multi-million-dollar portfolios with near-complete autonomy. He sold his luxury condo as planned, moving to a modest apartment in a less fashionable neighborhood. The Italian sports car was replaced by a sensible sedan. The expensive suits gave way to business casual attire appropriate to his reduced professional status. These external changes were significant but expected. What surprised me were the internal shifts they seemed to catalyze. One Sunday morning, he called to ask if he could stop by. When he arrived, he was carrying a familiar object, the chess, set his father had taught him to play on, one of the few items I had left him in my revised will. "I thought we might play," he said, setting up the board on the coffee table with careful, almost reverent movements. "It's been years." We settled into a game that progressed slowly, each of us remembering Richard's lessons about strategy, patience, and the consequences of impulsive moves. As we played, Daniel spoke about his new position, about the mentoring he was receiving from the firm's founder, an older man with old-fashioned ideas about financial responsibility. "He reminds me of Dad sometimes," Daniel admitted. "The emphasis on integrity over profit, on building gradually rather than chasing quick returns." He moved his bishop thoughtfully. "I resented it at first, felt like I was being treated like a beginner after years at the top, but I'm starting to see the value in relearning the fundamentals." I captured one of his pawns, listening more than responding, giving him space to articulate his evolving perspective. "The thing is," he continued, studying the board intently, "I was good at what I did before. Really good. But I'm not sure I was good in how I did it. The clients I prioritized, the corners I cut, the values I compromised." He looked up suddenly. "I blamed you when I got fired. Thought if you hadn't redirected the trust fund, I wouldn't have taken those risks." "And now?" I asked, moving my knight to protect my queen. "Now I see it was just the trigger, not the cause." The willingness to cross ethical lines was already there, the sense of entitlement, the belief that I deserved special treatment, that rules were for other people. He captured my knight with a deft move. Check. I studied the board, recognizing the trap he had skillfully constructed while we talked, always the strategist, my son, but perhaps now using his talents with greater awareness of their purpose and impact. "The new firm is sending me for ethics training," he said as I considered my move. "Not as punishment, but as preparation. They want me to eventually work with clients who prioritize socially responsible investing. It's a growing sector." "That sounds like a good fit," I observed, moving my king to safety. "Using your financial expertise in alignment with deeper values." He nodded, already planning his next move. "I'll never be a crusader like Melissa with her new advocacy kick. But I'm starting to see that wealth management doesn't have to be just about maximizing returns at any cost. It can be about helping people use money as a tool for positive impact." We played until sunset, neither of us winning decisively, both of us remembering Richard through the familiar rhythms of the game he had taught his son with such patience. As Daniel packed up the chess pieces, handling each one with care, he said something that stayed with me long after he left. "I always thought Dad's greatest gift to me was financial security. The trust fund, the education, the connections. Now I'm starting to think his real legacy was something else entirely. The example he set of quiet integrity, of wealth being a responsibility rather than just a privilege." Rebecca's journey unfolded differently still. True to her word, she and Jordan purchased a small fixer-upper far from the upscale neighborhood they had originally targeted. The process of renovation became the unexpected catalyst for her artistic renaissance. The limitations of their budget sparked creative solutions that translated into her professional work, bringing a fresh perspective that attracted new clients. She invited me to visit once they had completed the essential repairs, proudly showing me through rooms that bore the unmistakable mark of her artistic sensibility. Walls had been opened to create light-filled spaces. Salvaged materials had been repurposed in unexpected ways. What the house lacked in square footage and premium finishes, it made up for in character and thoughtful design. We couldn't afford new kitchen cabinets, she explained, running her hand along a countertop made of reclaimed wood. So Jordan and I learned how to refinish the old ones. Turns out there was beautiful maple underneath all that dated paint. We settled in her small but inviting living room, where a gallery wall displayed a mix of her own artwork and carefully chosen pieces by other artists. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would have appeared on that hospital room list of items to claim, but curated with genuine appreciation rather than status-seeking. "The wedding's going to be smaller than we originally planned," she said, handing me a cup of tea. "No grand ballroom, no 100-person guest list. Just close friends and family in the botanical garden." Jordan's relieved, actually. He never wanted the big production I was pushing for. "And you?" I asked. "Are you disappointed?" She considered this, tucking her feet beneath her on the sofa in a gesture reminiscent of her teenage self. Surprisingly, no. The more we stripped away the extras, the more I realized what actually matters to me about getting married. It's not the perfect venue or the designer dress. It's creating a meaningful ceremony with the people who truly know and support us. She reached for a sketchbook on the coffee table, flipping it open to show me designs for handcrafted wedding invitations. "I'm making these myself, each one slightly different with elements that reflect our relationship with that specific person. It takes longer, but it feels more authentic than the engraved stationery I was originally considering." As she showed me her designs, intricate, personal, filled with thoughtful details, I recognized a quality that had been largely absent in my children's adult lives until now: mindfulness. The capacity to be fully present with what they were, creating, rather than constantly straining toward the next acquisition, the next status marker, the next external validation. "I've been thinking about starting a small design studio," Rebecca said, setting aside her sketchbook. "Not just client work, but teaching workshops for people who want to bring more creativity into their homes without massive budgets, showing them how constraints can actually enhance creativity rather than limit it." "That sounds fulfilling," I said, genuinely impressed by this evolution in her thinking. "You've always had a gift for seeing beauty in unexpected places." "I lost sight of that somewhere along the way," she admitted. "Got caught up in the wrong measures of success, the prestigious clients, the magazine features, the social media following. This house, as modest as it is, has reconnected me with why I became a designer in the first place. To create spaces that reflect who people really are, not who they're trying to impress." As spring progressed, these individual transformations began to influence our collective family dynamic. The Sunday dinners that had once been perfunctory obligations marked by surface-level conversations evolved into more authentic gatherings. Not without tension or occasional retreats into old patterns, but with a growing capacity to move through difficult moments rather than around them. One particularly memorable evening, as we lingered over dessert, the conversation turned to the foundation. Melissa was describing a recent case, a mother of 4 with limited English and a complex diagnosis who was navigating treatment options without adequate translation services. "The hospital claims they provide interpreters," she explained, "but in practice, the family was using the patient's 11-year-old daughter to translate complex medical information. We're filing a complaint and arranging proper language services." "That's impressive work," Daniel commented, with genuine admiration rather than his former competitive edge. "Making tangible difference in someone's life. It feels more meaningful than negotiating corporate mergers," Melissa acknowledged, "though the paycheck is significantly smaller." "Isn't it strange," Rebecca mused, "how we all ended up reevaluating our relationship with money at the same time? Forced by circumstance. Maybe, but still." There was a brief, awkward silence as they all seemed to suddenly remember the circumstance that had precipitated these changes. my redirection of their trust funds after discovering their hospital room inventory. It was a subject we had largely avoided in our careful rebuilding of family connections. "I've been thinking about that day in the hospital," I said quietly, deciding that perhaps it was time to address directly what had remained largely unspoken. "About finding that yellow legal pad with your lists." They exchanged uncomfortable glances, none of them quite meeting my eyes. "I want you to know something important," I continued. "The decision I made afterward, to redirect the trust funds, to revise my will, it wasn't about punishment. It was about clarity. About finally seeing a dynamic that had developed so gradually I hadn't recognized it until that moment." "We understand that now, Mom," Melissa said, her typical assertiveness softened by what appeared to be genuine reflection. "At least I'm beginning to. It wasn't really about the money. It was about being seen as a person, not a resource." Daniel nodded slowly. "I didn't get it at first. Thought you were being vindictive, teaching us a lesson. But now I see you. We're just drawing a boundary. One we needed more than we realized." "I wouldn't choose to go through it again," Rebecca added. "The shock of losing what we expected, having to completely recalibrate our plans. But I can't deny that it's forced growth I might have avoided indefinitely otherwise." I looked at my 3 adult children, all successful in conventional terms, all now grappling with deeper questions about what truly constituted a meaningful life. The painful rupture had initiated changes I could never have engineered through gentler means. Not because the money itself had been the problem, but because its removal had disrupted patterns of entitlement that had calcified over decades. "I don't regret my decision," I told them honestly. "But I do sometimes wish we could have reached this point through a different path, one with less pain on all sides." "Maybe there wasn't another way," Melissa suggested. "Maybe we needed something that dramatic to really see ourselves clearly." Daniel leaned back in his chair, considering. "This. Dad used to say that character is revealed under pressure, not created by it. The hospital incident and what followed, it revealed things about all of us, things we needed to see, even if we didn't want to." The conversation continued into the evening, touching on regrets and realizations, on lessons learned and changes still in progress. There were no dramatic apologies or emotional declarations of transformed values. Just the quiet acknowledgement that we were all evolving, all learning to see each other more completely, all adjusting to a relationship based on respect rather than expectation. As they prepared to leave that night, each of my children embraced me with a quality of presence that felt new, an awareness of me as a person distinct from my role as their mother. Not with the dramatic appreciation of a Hallmark movie reconciliation, but with the authentic connection that comes from finally seeing someone as they truly are, limitations and strengths alike. After they left, I stood in my doorway, watching. Their cars disappear down the street. The house felt different now. Not because of any physical change, but because of a shift in my relationship to it and to the possessions it contained. The items my children had so carefully inventoried and divided in that hospital room no longer held the same emotional charge. They were just things, meaningful in some cases, practical in others, but not defining of my worth or central to my legacy. The following morning, Carmen arrived for her weekly cleaning, bringing news that her daughter Maria had been accepted to the nursing program she had been working toward. "She's so excited, Mrs. Harrington," Carmen beamed. "The first in our family to attend university. She says to thank you again for your encouragement." I thought about Maria, a young woman determined to build a career helping others, working multiple jobs while raising 3 children on her own. The house that would eventually be hers through my revised will would provide stability her family had never known. Not as an unearned windfall, but as support for someone already demonstrating tremendous resilience and purpose. "Please tell her I'm proud of her," I said sincerely. and that her children are fortunate to have a mother who shows them the value of persistence and hard work. Later that week, I received an update from the Elizabeth Margaret Foundation's executive director. The patient support programs were expanding to 3 additional hospitals. Research funding had contributed to a promising new treatment protocol. Melissa's multilingual advocacy program had been approved and would begin serving patients within the month. Your family's contribution is making a genuine difference, the director wrote, not just through funding, but through active involvement. Your daughter's legal expertise has been invaluable in developing services that truly meet patient needs. I sat with these updates, feeling a sense of purpose that transcended the difficult circumstances that had led to the Foundation's creation. What had begun as a response to betrayal had evolved into something independently meaningful, a legacy that would touch lives long after I was gone, in ways my original estate plan never would have. As spring fully established itself, I spent more time in my garden, watching the roses begin their annual return. Pruned back severely after their dormant period, they were now producing new growth, stems and leaves reaching toward the sunlight with renewed vigor. I thought about necessary losses, about how cutting away what is dead or damaged creates space for healthier development, about how true growth often requires difficult removals. One particularly beautiful afternoon, as I carefully tended to the emerging rose bushes, I heard a car pull into my driveway. Looking up, I saw a vehicle I didn't recognize, a modest sedan with a university parking sticker in the window. A young woman emerged, carrying a folder and looking somewhat nervous as she approached. "Mrs. Harrington?" she called. "I'm Sophia Mendez, from the Elizabeth Margaret Foundation. I hope it's okay that I stopped by. The director gave me your address." I welcomed her, curious about this unexpected visit. We sat in the garden, surrounded by the sweet scent of early blooms and fresh earth. "I received one of the Foundation's first grants," she explained, opening her folder to show me medical records and financial documents. "The same type of tumor you had, but without insurance. The Foundation covered my treatment costs and living expenses during recovery." She gestured to the car in the driveway. "I can drive to my follow-up appointments now instead of taking 3 buses. I can get my children to school on time." I listened as she shared her story, the initial diagnosis, the terror of facing a medical crisis without resources, the relief when the Foundation's support arrived. As she spoke, I felt a profound sense of connection to this young woman I had never met before, whose life had been touched by funds that once would have gone to children who didn't need them. "I wanted to thank you personally," Sophia said, reaching for my hand with genuine emotion. "The Foundation didn't just pay my medical bills. It gave me dignity during the most frightening time of my life. It let me focus on healing instead of worrying about becoming homeless." After she left, I remained in the garden, reflecting on the unexpected ripples created by a decision made in pain and clarity 6 months earlier. The trust funds that would have provided additional luxury for my already comfortable children were instead creating safety nets for people who genuinely needed them. The lessons my children were learning through having to rely more fully on their own resources were fostering growth I couldn't have anticipated. There was loss in what had happened, certainly. The easy, uncomplicated relationship I had once believed I had with my children could never be fully restored. The illusions about family loyalty and automatic respect had been permanently shattered in that hospital room. But in their place was emerging something I valued more: authentic connection based on mutual respect rather than expectation, genuine care rather than obligation. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across my carefully tended garden, I thought about the journey of the past 6 months. About how sometimes the most painful ruptures create space for necessary rebuilding. About how boundaries, though initially experienced as rejection, often make possible the very connection they seemed to threaten. I had not set out to teach my children a lesson when I redirected their trust funds. I had simply refused to continue participating in a dynamic that diminished my personhood. Yet in that refusal, in that clear establishment of limits, something unexpected had been set in motion, not just for them, but for me. A reclaiming of self-worth that extended beyond financial decisions to every aspect of how I engaged with the world. The woman who had discovered that hospital list, shocked, hurt, disbelieved, could never have imagined the transformations that would unfold from that painful moment. Could never have anticipated that an act of self-protection would ripple outward to touch lives far beyond our immediate family circle. Could never have foreseen that sometimes the greatest act of love is not endless giving, but the courage to finally say, enough. As darkness settled over the garden, I gathered my gardening tools and headed inside, moving through rooms that no longer represented assets to be divided, but simply the space where I lived my life. The home that had witnessed our family's most difficult reckoning was also witnessing its most authentic rebuilding. Not perfect, not complete, but real in a way it had never been before. And that reality, with all its complexity and occasional discomfort, felt more valuable than any inheritance I could possibly have left behind. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.